On a sunny day in 1961, a Greek freighter called the Captain Theo was passing through the channels of the Bahamas, about 125 miles from the Miami coast. Everything was going smoothly until Second Officer Nikolai Spagaitakis spotted a tiny speck on the distant horizon. After realizing the mystery dot was far too large to be a single piece of debris, but equally too small to be a boat that would travel so far out to sea, Nikolai convinced the captain to put the freighter on a collision course towards it. When the crew looked overboard, they spotted something unbelievable in the water. It was Terry Jo Duperrault, an 11-year-old girl barely clinging to life in a tiny cork dinghy. They hauled her to safety, but so many questions surrounded her unusual scene. Where had she come from? How had she survived? And why was she so far out in the middle of the ocean? Well, you're about to find out, but I warn you, her terrifying and tragic story will chill you to the core. Before we dive into this mystery, the true detectives among you will want to hit those like and subscribe buttons. I put out new videos covering shocking stories and fascinating facts every single day. So if you don't want to end up stranded in a sea of second-rate internet content, give that little bell icon a push and you'll be notified every time I upload. Now let's rewind to the fateful year of 1961. This was the year that Terry Jo's father, an optician named Arthur Duperrault, was able to fulfill his dream of taking his family on a once-in-a-lifetime sailing adventure. They lived in Green Bay, Wisconsin, so sailing further afield than the chilly green waters of Lake Michigan was something Arthur had been working hard to achieve. That year, he took his wife Jean, their 14-year-old son Brian, and daughters Renee and Terry Jo, just 7 and 11, out onto the azure tides of the Bahamas. They planned to spend a paradise-filled week out at sea on a chartered yacht. They arrived in Florida and rented the Bluebell, a ketch sailboat with 2 masts. Duperrault also brought along his friend and former Marine and World War II veteran Julian Harvey as his skipper, and Harvey's new wife, Mary Dean, tagged along too. For 4 stunning days, their vacation went exactly as planned. They headed east towards the tiny island chain of Bimini. There they spent a leisurely week collecting shells off the deserted white beaches and snorkeling through the clear emerald waters. But on the 5th day, as they began their return home, the tides took a dreadful turn. Early that morning, the boat docked at Sandy Point Village to sign papers commissioning their leave of the Bahamas back to the U.S. The commissioner, Robert Pender, spoke to Arthur Duperrault, who exclaimed, "This has been a once-in-a-lifetime vacation. We'll be back before Christmas." But his cheery prediction would never come true. At 9 p.m., Terry Jo made her way below deck to her cabin and fell asleep on her bunk. But in the middle of the night, a blood-curdling scream suddenly woke her up. It was her brother Brian, who was crying out, "Help, Daddy, help!" Loud stamping noises and the brief patter of running thudded along the deck above her. Then it went quiet. Too quiet. Confused and scared, Terry Jo crept out of her room, slowly tiptoeing towards the main cabin. With her heart in her throat, she opened the door, and that's when her world fell apart. The crumpled, lifeless bodies of her mother and brother lay still on the floor. She knew instantly that they were dead. In the cold grip of terror, she slowly backed away and climbed the stairs up to the main deck. When she looked around the dark deck, she saw pools of red reflecting the moonlight on the starboard side of the ship's cockpit. However, there was no sign of her father or sister. But as she was just about to call for help, Captain Harvey lunged at her. "Get back down there," he hissed, before shoving her down the stairs where she landed next to the bodies of her family. With her heart pounding in fear, Terry Jo crawled back to her bunk and tried to wake up from what seemed like a nightmare. But that's when she heard the sloshing sound of water flooding the compartment. At first, she thought Captain Harvey was trying to wash the blood away. It was only when the water kept rising that she realized the boat was actually sinking. But the little girl was too afraid to move. As she sat there terrified, she suddenly saw Captain Harvey's shadow approach her cabin door. He had something in his hand. Was it a gun? A knife? She wasn't sure. Before she could question it, he stormed back out. With water beginning to rise up over her mattress, she knew she had to follow him and get out fast. Wading through the waist-deep water, Terry Jo clambered back up the stairs. When she reached the top, she noticed that the ship's life raft was floating beside the boat. "Is the ship sinking?" she called out. "Yes," Harvey replied, before running up behind her shouting, "Hold this," and dropping the line to the raft into her hands. But Terry Jo was so confused by shock, and the line slipped through her numb fingers. Harvey jumped in after it, and she watched him swim out into the night. But little did she know, he would never return to help her. As the boat sank further and further into the waves, Terry Jo suddenly remembered the cork dinghy latched to the wall of the main cabin. She scrambled back down and untied it as the cabin rapidly filled with water, barely managing to make it out before the deck of the boat disappeared beneath her feet. But her terrifying ordeal still wasn't over yet. The dinghy's tethering line had gotten caught on the sinking ship, and for a heart-stopping moment she was dragged underwater with it. But miraculously the line broke free, and she bobbed to the surface. Half drowned, cold, and terrified, she huddled on the tiny raft and prayed that Captain Harvey wasn't waiting for her out in the dark open waters. Not to interrupt at a crucial moment or anything, but if you're enjoying this kind of video so far, you should totally let me know in the comments section. Even better, if you know of any more heart-thumping stories like this one that would make a great video, drop it down below. Now that your heart rate has slowed down a little bit, let's continue. Dressed only in a thin white blouse and pink pants, Terry Jo had nothing to protect herself from the chill of the night or the slowly rising heat of the day. As the sun rose up, temperatures soared to around 83 degrees Fahrenheit, and the unforgiving blaze scorched her skin. There was no land in sight, and no nearby boat she could flag down. With each passing hour, her mouth became more parched and her exposed skin burned. But as the sun rose on the second day, she saw a small red plane circling overhead. With what little energy she had, she used her blouse to try and signal it, but the angle of the plane made it impossible for the pilots to see her. Although she didn't know it, she was floating hopelessly across the Northwest Providence Channel. Without any intervention, she'd soon drift north along the Gulf Stream and further out into the middle of the ocean. But the water was the least of her worries. It was what was lurking beneath that was a real cause for concern. She'd already spotted several fear-inducing fins around her raft, but Terry Jo was about to receive the first good news she'd had in 2 days. They weren't sharks, they were porpoise. Still, not even the porpoise could help her though, and as the sun set on her second day stranded at sea, she was no closer to being rescued. By the morning of the third day, the exhausted little girl began to hallucinate. Without water, humans can survive for about 3 or 4 days, and as she battled against such hot conditions, little Terry Jo was rapidly approaching that deadly limit. She thought she could see a tiny island on the horizon and used up much of her precious strength to paddle towards it, but as she approached, the illusion dissipated. Exhausted and dehydrated, she fell unconscious. Close to death and battered by the unrelenting waves, she remained in a deep sleep until the mid-morning of the 4th day. A gigantic shadow was blocking out the sun, giving her a little respite from the sun's rays. As she looked up, she saw she was in the wake of a giant ship. It was the Captain Theo. The crew were frantically waving their arms and shouting at her, and before she knew it, she was being lifted to safety. She had survived the horrific ordeal at sea, but little did she know that she wasn't the first member of the Bluebell to be found. Just 1 day after the little sailboat had sunk, Captain Harvey had been picked up by a Puerto Rico-bound oil tanker named the Gulf Lion. He was found in the lifeboat along with the body of Terry Jo's 7-year-old sister, Renee. Harvey told the Coast Guard that the main mast of the sailboat had snapped in a storm of 20 knots winds, which pierced the deck and hull. Then he said a fire had broken out and everyone jumped overboard. By the time he managed to reach the lifeboat, he could only find Renee's body floating in the water. The Coast Guard believed his story hook, line, and sinker until Terry Jo was found alive. According to news reports, Harvey's testimony of the dreadful event was interrupted by a fateful phone call, informing him a little girl from the wreck had been found. Instead of looking relieved, Harvey was startled. He suddenly rushed from the room crying, "Oh my God." I guess subtlety wasn't quite in his repertoire. Disturbed by his reaction, the Coast Guard ordered armed guards to be stationed at Terry Jo's hospital bed. But as it turned out, it wasn't Terry Jo he intended to harm. Reports filtered through the next day that Julian Harvey had been found dead in his Miami motel room. He had checked in the day before under a false name and decided to take his own life using a razor blade. But what kind of man would fight to survive such a terrible ordeal at sea, only to suddenly end his own life? While the Coast Guard were inching closer to their own conclusion, the conscious and recovering Terry Jo revealed the horrendous truth 2 days later. There had been no storm. There was no fire. She had seen the lifeless bodies of her mother and brother before the Bluebell sank. This definitely hadn't been an accident. If Terry Joe's own suspicions weren't enough, Captain Harvey's shady behavior in the lead up to his death was, and the Coast Guard came to a horrifying conclusion. The 4 members of the Duperrault family and Mary Dean Harvey had all been murdered by Julian Harvey. But one huge question still loomed over the whole terrible affair. Why? What caused the captain to snap at sea and commit such a hideous crime? Miami's best homicide detectives did some research and came up with a single motive that spread shockwaves across the country: money. Only a short time before the voyage, Harvey had taken out a $40,000 life insurance policy on Mary, whom he'd married just 4 months before. With inflation, that would be worth about $350,000 in today's money. Detectives suspected that Harvey intended to make his wife's death at sea look like the perfect accident in order to claim all that cold hard cash. But he was interrupted by Arthur Duperrault, which prompted Harvey to improvise by killing the entire family, removing all witnesses, and purposefully sinking the boat to hide the crime scene. It's unclear if little Renee's body was just part of his cover story, or if he thought Terry Joe would do first, which is why he feigned an attempt to save her. It seems that, although he only intended to snuff out the life of his new lover, Harvey had no trouble bumping the whole clan off to ensure his evil plan wasn't foiled. It sounds unbelievably malicious, but it seems like this wasn't the first time Harvey had gotten away with murder. Once an American Air Force pilot, he'd had not 1, not 2, but 5 wives before poor Mary. However, his second wife Joan met a similarly gruesome end. One rainy night, he was driving Joan and her mother back from the movies when the car careened off a bridge and sank into the bayou below. Harvey was the only survivor, claiming he had escaped from the car while it was in midair. It may sound like a rather tall tale, but it was enough for Harvey to cash in the insurance policy he'd placed on Joan. Even more suspiciously, the Bluebell wasn't the first boat to sink under his command. His vessel, the Torbatros, sank in Chesapeake Bay, and he had sued the government for negligence to the tune of $14,000. He used the money to buy another boat, an 81-foot luxury yacht called the Valiant. Can you guess what happened next? In 1958, during an ugly divorce with his wife Georgiana, Harvey was captaining the Valiant off the coast of Mexico when it mysteriously caught fire and sank. He claimed $40,000 on the insurance, which all too conveniently saved him from his financial difficulties. But after the incident with the Bluebell, it wasn't long before people who knew Harvey came forward and told the papers that he enjoyed a lavish lifestyle he really couldn't afford. So it seems he developed a nasty habit of committing all manner of fraud in order to fund his expensive addictions. Isn't it ironic that amongst all the shady dealings in his past, the thing that would eventually pull the curtain on Harvey's homicidal hijinks was the tenacity of an ordinary 11-year-old girl? As heartbreaking as her ordeal has been, Terry Joe made a full recovery, and her story even sparked an important change in the maritime world. In fact, she came very close to not being rescued at all. In 1962, crew members of the Captain Theo reported how hard it had been spotting Terry Joe in the water because of the dull white coloring of her dinghy. That year, it became law that all life-saving devices be colored orange because it's the opposite color of blue on the color wheel and is therefore easier to spot in the water. So if you ever find yourself being saved by one of these bright orange or yellow life jackets, you have one incredibly heroic little girl to thank. Do you think you could have survived such a terrifying tragedy in the middle of the ocean? And do you have any incredible survival stories of your own to tell? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.